It's time for us to check back in with Verna Mae and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. A lot has been written and said about Mrs. Lloyd, the lady who came from Boston and established a school on Caney. She and her mother, June Buchanan, and many others will be remembered. There are a lot of other folks, our mountain people, who in their way did just as much. Without them, the school would have died before it was born. Just common folks, and I wish I could tell something about each and every one, make it interesting enough that you would want to read it. I haven't time nor space, but I do want to list a few. There was Miles, Henry, John, and Dan Jacobs, all brothers and all stonemasons. They built the rock wall, the chimneys, the foundation for some of the houses. George Tuttle and William Reynolds, who ran the sawmill that cut the lumber to build the houses, once a week they also ground corn into meal, using the same motor. Part of the corn received for this service gave meal for bread used by the school. Isom Kitney Slone, his son Morrell, and preacher Billy Slone made the chairs used in the school. Mrs. Lloyd also sold many of these for an extra income. Bish Johnson, who built the fires in all the buildings, often carrying the coal on his back in a sack. Sam Allen, the janitor for many years, and his wife Rhoda helped with the laundry for the school. Dellie Slone, Sarah Tuttle, Laura Slone, and Monty Jones were cooks. Sarah Taylor began as a weaver and taught weaving, then worked many years as a handywoman, collecting and distributing the laundry. Vansel Slone, Troy and John Sparkman dug the coal used by the school. Carew, Ike, and Nick Slone, all brothers, ran the first printing machine. Lawrence Slone also helped them. Mr. Gibson, I don't know his first name, ran the Delco generator that supplied electricity. There was Merlin Reynolds, the night watchman, Commodore Slone, the architect that drew up all the plans for the buildings, bridges, etc. Then there were the women who sold the school their fruits, vegetables, milk, and eggs. I remember seeing them go each and every morning with 2 large buckets of milk or eggs or whatever. These people worked for little pay or no pay. Many months Mrs. Lloyd would not have the money to make good the checks she wrote them. True, when she got a donation or help from some source, she divided it with each and every one she owed. These people did not complain. They shared her dream and were willing to help. Although their families needed money, they wanted a school more. The school is slowly changing. Only a few of the first buildings are left. Some of the students are from out of state, many from other countries. It's true some people are trying to renew the old Caney spirit, but again, the outside is taking over, like our Appalachia Day. For the first few years, it was just a day for us local people where we met, showed our handicraft, and played music. The last day, most of our local folks did not get to take part. The outsiders had again taken over, playing their music and selling their handicraft. Which reminds me of what my father once said to one of Mrs. Lloyd's brought-on teachers who was telling him she disapproved of how his daughters dressed. He said, "We don't like what you all wear either, but we have good manners enough to not tell you to your face." Mrs. Lloyd helped many boys and girls after they finished their 2 years of college here, sending them on to other colleges for 2 or more years. I am almost sure she would have helped with my 5 sons' education had I asked her, but I did not want to be beholden to anyone. My father always taught me, never be too proud to ask for help, but make sure you can't do the job yourself. It was very hard sometimes. My husband and I worked extra hard. The boys also did not have it easy. They would teach on an emergency certificate, going to school in summer, taking night classes, often driving many miles. I want to say their wives helped just as much. They all married in their teens. You can't blame me if I am proud of a job well done. I think I did just as much for my children as the richest people on earth because I did all I could do with what I had to do. And that's all God asked any of us to do. We moved from our home on Bunyan to the new one close to the center, as the school was then called. It was only a 2-mile distance. My new neighbors were the same folks I had known all my life. Yet there were many differences. Small things, no better or worse, but took a little getting used to. It had been so hard when living up in the head of a hollow to get in and out that we had always bought our groceries in large quantities. 50-pound cans of lard, 100 pounds of beans, even sugar and salt by the 100-pound bags. It seemed so funny to me to know of large families buying a nickel's worth of salt and a dime of sugar, buying only enough for one meal at a time. Many times I was asked to get up after going to bed and open the store for someone who had forgotten something they needed for breakfast. We had always, like all people who live up the hollers, gone to bed with the chickens and gotten up with them, an expression meaning we went to bed at the same time that our chickens went to roost. Maybe this is where a certain writer got the idea we let the chickens live in the house with us. Our new neighbors were up until all hours and slept late. Another thing, while at our old home, children were allowed to visit each other only now and then. When they did go to play with each other, a time limit was set on each visit, and it was understood the visitors were to help with the chores or help to do up the work. Feeding the animals, carrying in wood and coal, bringing in water. Now the children of the folks living near the school had none of those chores to do. They were allowed to go from one house to another at will. I tried to keep my children in my own yard, so I ended up with almost all the kids, which was just fine with me. The more, the merrier. We'd spent most of our savings for the new house, so I wanted some way to help out to save more, to have ready for the boys' college education. The folks we bought from had run a small grocery store, and I took the rest of our money and stocked this store. I could write a whole book on the ups and downs of a country store, and probably will if I live long enough. In a small community, the store is not just a place to buy groceries, it's a meeting place to keep up with all the news. In many ways, it took the place of a local newspaper. Someone was always leaving something to be given to someone else, a bushel of apples, a hen, or a book. If anyone had something to sell or buy, they left word with me to pass on. Also, folks came in to use my weights, to learn the weight of everything from a ham of meat, a few ounces of ginseng, or their new baby. Also, it was a gathering place for young folks. Many a romance that ended in marriage was begun over a Pepsi in my store. Some of the older folks who had walked out of the hollers to go to the Exchange, a store where Mrs. Lloyd sold second-hand clothes, wished to wait until the mail ran and would spend the hours waiting with me. I took advantage of this. I kept my quilting frames in one end of the store, and the women folks always were glad to quilt a few rows while we talked. In some of our mountain country stores, the post office was also in the same building. My father had had a post office at High Rock in the upstairs of our home, going in by an outside stairway. When Mrs. Lloyd came, she had a new building and changed the name to Pippa Pass, later to Pippa Passes. The new post office was first run by Mrs. Geddes, then Mattie Pridemore, followed by Verna Slone. It's still in the same building, very soon to be moved again, maybe by the time this is printed. In Mrs. Geddes' day, the business part of the post office was much smaller. The front was a kind of lobby, furnished with tables and chairs, with such a friendly atmosphere that you wanted to linger and chat. People seemed to have so much more time then to just be friends, yet they did as much, if not more, work than we do now. I do so long to go back to those good old days. I did not only sell groceries, but feed, a few hardware items like nails, files, hose, and tacks, some dry goods, overalls, shirts, yard goods, oilcloth, thread, and cotton batting for quilts. I made a lot of good friends while running my store. You learn a lot about people by knowing what they buy. When you cash their checks, you can't help but know their income. They also share their joys and sorrows with you. Some cause you to lose faith in human nature, but there are always others who come along to renew it. I think there is no better place to study your fellow man than in a small country store. When we first moved to our new home, I was to renew an acquaintance with a dear cousin of mine, Verna Slone. My life was certainly made much richer by knowing him and his family. His 3 youngest boys were waiting to help unload the truck of furniture when we arrived and were just one of us from then on. Again, I'm handicapped by the lack of an education to help me to picture to you the kind of person Carew was. I'm sure he would have been the last person to have wanted to be described with highfalutin words. He would have been proud to just be one of my common folks. He was one of the best. He was not the kind of person you would have picked out in a crowd, small in size, a smile that lighted up his whole face, a small crippled body that housed a soul as large as our hills. He had more courage in his little crooked fingers than a lot of men have in their whole bodies. His beauty was all from the inside. To know him was to love him. I guess of any one person in Knott County, he had more friends than anyone else. When we bought our first truck in 1952, none of my boys were old enough to drive. Willie's job kept him away from home. Carew did a lot of driving for us. His job as a printer at the college gave him some free time. Sometimes we would go to Pikeville or Prestonsburg to buy groceries from the wholesale house. I got them cheaper if I picked them up myself. Once we went to Ashland to get the lumber with which he built me some kitchen shelves. Even then his hands had begun to bother him with arthritis. Once I remember he went with Orban to get his bicycle from a boy who had stolen it. But sometimes we just took the children, his and mine, on pleasure trips. Them and as many other Creek kids that could pile in the back of our pickup would go to a movie at Heinemann. Once we went to hear Bill Monroe. I would like to say I was very disappointed in this bluegrass singer that my husband was so crazy about. We took the kids also to see Homer Harris and his Wonder Horse. Losses and Vernon were delighted when Homer let them ride the horse. They were the only ones allowed to do this, much to the envy of all the other little boys on Caney. Marguerite, Carew's wife, did not go with us. She was even then sick a lot. She was a very home-loving person who liked nothing better than to stay at her home with her family, very seldom going anywheres except to church. There are so many things I would love to write about Carew. All his children got more education than he had, although he had been a school teacher. They all live in very beautiful homes. They have a lot to be proud of and a great name to live up to. He had so much determination and willpower. He kept coming to church long after many folks would have given up. The last few times he had to be carried in by his son-in-law. The last election he went to, his hands were so crippled that he could not use the voting machine, and rather than let someone help him, he made a hook from a clothes hanger so he could move the pulley with it. Once on his birthday, his children gave him a surprise party by having a church service in one of their homes. Having church or a religious gathering in the homes is a traditional thing carried on by the old regular Baptists, a custom that begun when our folks first settled here before they built church houses. Carew always had a kind word for everyone. He was a deputy clerk and wrote many deeds for folks, never wanting any pay for it. He loved to joke. He always called me Old Ugly in fun. The last time I went to visit him before he died, I asked him if he knew who I was because he had been so sick for a while that he had not known anyone. He looked up at me and grinned. "No," he said very slowly, "I don't believe I do, Verna Mae." Then he turned to the crowd and asked, "Why did she think I would not know that old ugly face? It's the same one she's had all her life." People outside of the family or outside of the mountains would not have understood what he meant and thought I should have taken offense. We are not people who easily express our emotions in words, but I knew what he meant. It was, "You are my cousin, I like you, and I know you like me, so I can call you Old Ugly." And he may have known he was telling me goodbye. Carew was not the only good neighbor we had. There was Verna Mae Slone, the postmaster, who came and carried Losses in his arms to and from his car, taking him to the hospital at Lackey when Losses had pneumonia. Willie and Orban were in the Hazard Hospital at the same time, Willie for a nasal operation, and Orban was having his tonsils removed. Commodore Slone and his wife, Jeanette, were good neighbors. Jeanette was such a pal to the young folks on Caney that they nicknamed her Jim Netta, much to her delight. All my boys, as well as several of their friends, learned to drive a car by taking her wherever she needed to go in her own car. She always owned one, but never learned to drive. I think she did it more for the boys' sake than her own. She also kept them in spending money by paying them to mow her lawn, tend her flowers and vegetables, to pick apples and wash windows, always giving them more than they earned. I had stayed a lot with her when I went to school. I guess there are hundreds of folks she helped this way. Seems as if there was always someone there to help eat her delicious meals. She was an artist cook, loving to cook more than anyone I ever knew. Ethel Jacobs was my next-door neighbor up the road. We became very good friends. We would go with the kids to take care of them when they went trick-or-treating, go together to pick salad greens, go walk the television line. The antenna for a television was set on top of the hill and a line run from it to the house. It was always getting broken by a fallen limb or heavy snow. We would go and repair this line. Work? No, a lot of laughs and fun. If someone was to ask me what was the most embarrassing moment of your life, I would have to tell the following story. When we moved from our home on Bunyan to our new home, which was only new to us, we also had to move our farm animals. The new place had the usual barn, pig pens, chicken house, and cow shed. Marion Jacobs hauled our furniture in his pickup truck. Verna Slone took the pigs in a sled. We waited until after dark to get the chickens. They are easy caught off the roost. But the cow was another problem altogether. Her young calf was about 6 weeks old. We had promised to sell the calf to one of the neighbors, so we thought it best just to leave it in the barn for him to get that evening. The cow did not like the idea of leaving her baby behind, and even after being safe in the new barn, she kept wanting to return to where she thought her baby still was. I kept hoping she would soon forget, but the longer, the worse, and every chance she got, she would try to return. One morning, after everyone was gone but myself, I took the cow to the creek for a drink of water. Suddenly, she jerked the rope from my hands and got away. Up and down, first in the road, then the creek, I kept chasing. Our dog, Old Ranger, began helping. His barking called all the other neighboring dogs to the rescue. The poor cow became so confused, she did not know what to do. We ended up with me in front of the high school building and her going on through the college. I was desperate. I knew if she got on the highway, she would be hit by a car. I thought as I was already there, I would just go into the school and get my 2 oldest boys to help. I had not been there before, so I did not know which room to go to. I thought I would knock on the first door I came to and ask if my boys were there. I've always been a person that when excited or confused would say something off the top of my head. When I timidly gave a soft knock, there must have been something wrong with the catch or hinges on the door, and it began to open by itself. I gave a grab for the knob, missed, and went stumbling into the room. As I looked at those rows and rows of silent faces with questioning eyes, I heard myself stuttering, "Is my cow in here?" Can you just imagine what those students thought? There I stood, splattered with mud, my husband's big overshoes on, my hair stringing, my apron tied over my head. Well, if the teacher had not been a cousin of mine, he would probably have sent after the men in white coats and a straitjacket for me. I guess my scribblings are like my crazy quilts without any form or unity. The more I write, the more I remember. There are just so many things I want to say. Maybe some are interesting only to me. Our young folks have lost so much without ever knowing they never had it to lose. It's also true that sometimes truth seems more strange than fiction. God must have a certain purpose for my 4th son, Willie Vernon. He has come so near death and yet lived. I will not write all of these near escapes, but only 3. On Christmas Day in 1947, when Vernon was just past 3, his grandmother died. I believe that was one of the coldest spells I ever remember. A deep snow, creeks froze over from bank to bank, temperatures way below 0. Willie had been staying with his mother for 2 weeks or over. He sent me word to not try and bring the children to the funeral. My oldest son loved his grandmother so much that he wanted to go, so we bundled up and started. It's not over 2 miles distance from our house to where she was at another one of her sons. As I've said before, we did not think anything about walking, even children. We knew of no other way. It wasn't so cold as long as we were between the hills. We had to walk very slow because the children were small and the snow deep. When we got to the top of the hill, the road ran for a long way around the ridge, and here there was no shelter. I knew we should go faster, so I asked Milburn to carry Vernon on his back, and I would lead the way with the other two. Vernon was small to his age. He only weighed 68 pounds when he was 11, so Milburn could easily carry him. We'd walked on for some time. It was so cold we were not trying to talk when Milburn said, "Mom, I think something's wrong with Vernon. He is just all slumped down and quit holding on to my neck." I looked, and although his eyes were open, I knew he was not seeing. I quickly felt for his heart and found it warm. When I took him from Milburn, his arms and legs did not relax but remained in the same position. I pulled my coat off and wrapped it around him and started running on, shouting back for Milburn to bring the other two as fast as he could. I remember running, stumbling, falling, praying, the cold air like knives in my lungs. I kicked on the back door and stumbled into the kitchen. When the warm air hit me, I passed out as someone took Vernon from my arms. Later, I was told that some went to find the other boys, others took care of Vernon and me. Too late, I remembered what my father had always told me, to never quit moving when out in the cold. It would have been better to have had Vernon to keep walking, or better still, to have kept them all at home. Exciting place to stop right there. Interesting peek again into Verna Mae's life. I especially liked the beginning where she's talking about all the neighbors that pitched in to help at the school, at Mrs. Lloyd's school, and kind of naming all the different stuff that they did, from bringing their fruits and vegetables to sell, to carrying the coal and starting the fire, to the rock stonemasons that build up the chimneys in the buildings. So fascinating to hear about all of them. The ones that did the laundry, I love it because of that sense of community, of everybody pitching in, but I also love it because of someone who's wrote about Appalachia for so long, because this is just a prime example of the fact that people who lived in Appalachia also cared about education. They wanted their kids to learn. They wanted them to be smart. They wanted them to have all the same opportunities. Now, that wasn't always possible in some situations, but this is just a real example of how they would pitch in together for the good of everyone, but especially for the good of their children, so that they could have that education that they knew would help them have a better life. So I really like that example. I always love it when I find a really old example like that I can tuck away to share people who think that if I come across someone who thinks that we didn't care about education. Certainly in those days you can tell that Verna Mae's community did. I know in my lifetime it's been certain that education was something people cared about. Even in Pap's time, the stories that he's told me, and the way the families would pitch in for the school. So I really, really loved that beginning part. Another part that I liked right there at the beginning was kind of, it's kind of sad, it's bittersweet, but when she's talking about that their Appalachia Day was kind of took away from them, and then it become about something else. But the part and that's really sad, but the part I really liked was what her daddy said to the brought-on teacher. So the brought-on teacher just means that it was a teacher that was from somewhere else. And so when she, told him she didn't like how his daughters dressed, it kind of makes you wonder, was it because they were their clothes were raggedy, or maybe they weren't warm enough, or whatever it was, what she didn't like about them. Maybe she didn't like the style. But I really like what Kit and I told her. He said, we don't like what you wear either, but we have better manners than to tell you that. So I really like that, and I found that to be true. Of course, you can never say a blanket statement about anybody. Like, I can't say everyone in Appalachia is good, because they're certainly not. There's lots of bad people. But that kind of general feeling is very alive and well, obviously in Verna Mae's day, but even today, there's no gate at Appalachia. People come and go. People move in here, especially in the last 2 years. My area of Appalachia has seen a great influx of people leaving cities and leaving places. They want to get back to that more rural kind of lifestyle. And I think Kit and I kind of summed it up. Most people don't mind if you come, you know, because it's a free country. You can do whatever you want to do. There's no, like I said, there's no one holding you back. But they do mind when you make fun of the people that are already here, like the, you know, the long-standing people. Maybe it's the way they dress, maybe it's the way they talk, maybe it's the way they look at the way their local culture is, or the things that are available, or even the local government kind of deal. So that part, I really like that, though, that he told her, you know, no, I don't really like how you dress either, but I don't tell you. I don't say that to hurt your feelings, and because it's really the way he was looking at it, I'm sure, is the way a lot of people who live in my area look at it, like, is those things are not any of my business. So you do what you do, but you let me do what I do too. You know, kind of the same thing. So then she goes from that to talking about the stores, how she opened the store once they got to that location to make her some extra money to help the family, pay for the boys' colleges. Oh, don't you just wish you could go back there and sit and talk to Verna Mae and see the people that come? Maybe they had a bushel of beans they were leaving for, you know, their grandmother or aunt or somebody that was going to buy them from them. Or maybe it was the young lovebirds drinking a Pepsi together. I would have loved to have been around that quilt frame. I can't quilt. I can barely sew on a button. But I would have liked to have been there to hear what the ladies said, what they talked about. I love those, though, and even today I think there's stores that are still like that. It's kind of the meeting place. For sure, just like everything else, big box stores and big gas stations have kind of done away with the small little country stores, but there are still some. I think about in my childhood, there was over in Martins Creek, there was Doris Jeans. I think it was really probably technically Ash's, but we just always called it Doris Jeans. But I think it was a place like that where you never went that you didn't talk about who was well and who was sick, who might need prayers, who was building this, who was doing that. Of course, down below my house today, there's Clay's. Before that, it was Scroggs's. So in that day, Scroggs's, it was the same kind of thing. Before that, it was something else. I think the Caldwells owned it before that. But those little places like today, Clay's, where people gather and talk, a lot of times, especially of the mornings, Pap and a lot of the older men in the community would gather there, and they would drink coffee and just talk. And I see, of course, Pap's gone now, but when I drive by there sometimes early in the morning, I see a bunch of trucks there, and I think they're back there talking. They're you know, talking about this or that and sharing news and fellowshipping one with another. So those memories of Verna Mae's stores, all those little things she shared, is just amazing. Of course, times are different now. But it's nice to know in some places there's still a little bit of that going on. Another interesting thing that she talked about was that when she was talking about her cousin, it sounds like maybe he had really debilitating arthritis or some kind of disease like that, some kind of sickness that he was suffering from that eventually made it where he couldn't walk and stuff. But she was talking about his family surprised him by having church. That reminded me, when I was a girl, lots of people had what we called prayer meetings. It was prayer meetings you'd have at people's houses. Lots of times here now, they have prayer meeting on Wednesday night at the church, but in those days, even when I was a girl, they would often have, especially if someone was sick, maybe you would have a prayer meeting at their house, and everyone would come, and then they would pray for that person. So I really, really liked that part of thinking about that, how comforting that had to be for her cousin Carew, and how wonderful it probably made them all feel to be able to give him that joy and make him feel good. And all the neighbors, not just him, but all the neighbors that she talked about, you just wish you could go back and know them. And then it made me in turn start thinking about my neighbors. Well, if I was writing a book, what would I say? What story would I tell about this neighbor or that neighbor? And those kind of little, it kind of goes back to, she didn't mention it in this part that we read today, but it goes back to those other chapters that we've read where she's talking about the little things in life, how that makes up the big part of life, how that really is your life. I think that about the neighbors, you know. No one would care, probably. I don't know. I care what Verna Mae said, even though I don't know those people that she was talking about. But when I think about my neighbors here in Martins Creek and Brasstown, I think, well, who would care if I had this to say about them or that to say about them? But it makes me want to write a book about them, write about the goodness, you know, the goodness that abounds in the stories and the way they helped, you know, like she was talking about the one neighbor that they would walk the telephone, or not telephone, the TV line, you know, that for the antenna, and then the ones that helped her take her kids to the doctor, all those different things. Just so heartwarming to have a community like that. So that part really made me think, I want to write down everything I know about all my neighbors, the goodness that abounds in them. really encouraging that part, if we could all have that kind of outlook like Verna Mae. And of course, neighbors are not always great either, I know that. But I really love my neighbors, so I was touched by that part of the book. And then the last thing I'd written down was the cow story. What wonderful. I can just see, can't you just see Verna Mae? I think about when I go out to the chickens, I wear Matt's big mud boots, pig boots we call them, and they're usually got mud caked all over them and other things. And like she was saying, her hair was coming down, she had her apron over her head, and then she busted in the schoolroom, you know, and you could just see all the kids looking at her like, what's this woman doing? So that was, I can see why that would be her most embarrassing thing that she had ever done. But boy, I would have liked to have been there to seen it. I would have liked to have been there. And since the teacher was her cousin, I bet the teacher just laughed. I bet he was like, yeah, this is Verna Mae. I know she's up to something. I know something's going on. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. Please leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you, what was your favorite part. And please drop back by next Friday so that we can find out what happens next with Verna Mae.